My name is Hugo Pope, and I am a collector of rarities. It is a collection I have amassed over some time, at a most considerable cost, and it is quite rightly regarded as among the most expensive in the world. In its eclectic mix of items, books, jewelry, artworks, medical specimens, even properties, and any number less quantifiable artifacts. But they all have one thing in common. Each has rather a macabre story behind it. Some of my peers may find it such a distasteful, but they don't see the beauty that can be found in the shadows if one is just prepared to look. People often speak the fruits in of blood, sweat, and tears, but how many of them ever really stop to think about what phrase truly entails? My most recent acquisition is also one of the rarest and one that has eluded me for a year. I have always derived the greatest pleasure from creative output of some of the world's most misunderstood minds. I have a number of paintings on my wall and some of the most notorious death row inmates. I have one of the 4 copies of supposedly cursed novel, The Glass Missionary. I even have a grainy but highly convincing copy of the infamous video, The CO.AG. Yet the art that moves with me the most and always has been music. As such, I have taken great interest, bordering on the fantastical, if truth be told, in collecting compositions of those rare individuals who are not just prepared to accept their inner darkness, but to embrace it. I had first heard about the Abattori Concerto at least 20 years ago. It was from a fellow collector, an Englishman named Julian Call, who delightfully regaled me with all the ghoulish details of the piece's black backstory in his parlor. "You mean to tell me," he gasped with shock, mock surprise, and poorly concealed glee, "that you've never heard of Lucien Mortimer?" I regarded him as coolly over the top, up with brandy glass. Then he nodded curtly, a begrudging confession of my ignorance. "Well, well, old chap," he cried, clapping his hands together as his heavy-lidded eyes widened in excitement. "Do you allow me to enlighten you?" I had to repress the urge to roll my eyes in an incorrigible old ham basket in the moment. Yet I listened on. "Lucien Mortimer," Call began theoretically. "He was arguably the most successful butcher in the East End of London during the later years of Queen Victoria's reign. He had not one or two, but no fewer than 4 large slaughterhouses, butchering hundreds of animals' carcasses each day. His meat was very much sought after, not just by the poor common people of the East End, but the nobility of London's more upland suburbs. When it came to flesh, Momenter was quite the artiste." Cole grinned at me in flickering firelight, with his lean visage of all more cadaverous in the eerie glow. But he was much more than that. Rumors spread around amongst the citizens of London that Mortimer was also an outcast, word that has occurred in the first for acknowledgeable of otherworldly bent and self-educated as he was. He read everything he could on the beings of more superstitious folk might dub demons. I shifted in past my seat, intrigued by this development in this story, while Call continued. Word spread that Mortimer might even have communicated with such beings, and he soon gathered a flock of loyal followers. One can understand why. Cole licked his lips in relish as he went on. Mortimer was a giant of man. Some who have more nonsensical stories at the time he claimed he stood nearly 10 feet tall. I snorted in disbelief, a sound that drew an irritated glance from Call. Of course, that was merely excited exaggeration. My own research suggests that he was actually a fraction over 7 feet tall, which was almost unheard of that day and age. He noticed my cocked eyebrow and smiled smugly. "I have managed to obtain one of the man's shirts. He must have been very impressive indeed." I gritted my teeth and attempted to smile back, seething at his collection that would have such an artifact while mine went without. Right there and then, I swore to myself that it would have been my last laugh here. He said he to have a deep booming voice, a dark blazing eyes, and his acolytes were utterly devoted him and followed him blindly. Soon rumors spread of unholy rituals conducted after dark in his slaughterhouses. Cole leaned forward then, lowering his voice for effect. Stories of sacrifices, but nevertheless, the local constability kept their distance. You see, several members of Mortimer's flock were from well-to-do families, some Victorian society wealthiest and most influential dynasties. So fearful of invoking the wrath of these individuals, the authorities turned a blind eye to the disturbing accusations leveled towards Lucien Mortimer and his followers. Cole paused to take a sip of his brandy, the fire cracking gently in the background. His eyes crinkled playfully from beneath his doomed forehead, the small black skull cap he wore in stark contrast to his graying hair. But that changed after the performance, he replied. I questioned, curious despite my efforts not to encourage Cole's flamboyance. Oh yes, he cried, raising one finger to emphasize his point. The performance of Abattori Concerto. He paused for a dramatic effect, taking another lengthy sip of his brandy before continuing. Mortimer's masterpiece. An untrained musician, Lucien Mortimer, taught himself to read music so that he might create it, a process that took the man 6 long years of painstaking work, in which he tinkered and retinkered with his composition until finally he deemed it complete. It was the only piece he ever wrote. You know, he said, leaning in conspiratically, glancing from side to side as if afraid of being overheard. They say he may have glued to otherworldly beings from he had gained power, that this was his way of repaying them for success they had afforded him over the years. I scoffed again, but this time it was less convincing sound that was met by a twitch of Cole's lips beneath his hooked nose, and it was considerable demand to hear the piece when he finally declared its completion. His acolytes had told their wealthy families and friends that it was a piece that transcended their music. When it was announced that it was to be performance at the Abattori Concerto, demand feverish and tickets exchanged hands with princey sums. When it was revealed that Mortimer would perform at the piece of the largest of his slaughterhouse, the gentry was whipped into a frenzied anticipation by the thought of attending such a ghoulish setting. Finally, a night of the performance came, and the giggling audience filled throughout the high doors into the slaughterhouse, resplendent in their jewelry, furs, and finery. When the last of them took their seat, Mortimer's followers closed and barred the doors behind them. Cole sank to the back of his seat and proceeded to refill his brandy glass from the decanter beside his chair. It was simply too much to take. Yes, well, and then I barked, my frustration getting the better of me. Damn you, Julian, you terrible bastard. Get on with it. Cole laughed then, at that throaty chuckle of that never ceased him to infuriate me, before his raising palms in the placatory gesture. Of course, give me a moment. Old boy, the truth is, nobody really knows what happened in the slaughterhouse that night. It wasn't until 9 the following morning that everyone else ventured inside the building. It was a group of policemen, followed on the anxious reports that the attendees that evening had never returned home. Upon breaking down the door, the policemen bore witness to a scene of carnage, unlike that they had never seen before. Later on, one of the officers, a man who has been in the attendance at the scene where Mary Kelly was found murdered and dismembered by Jack the Ripper, and said the interior of the slaughterhouse made Ripper's work look like child's play. There was no signs of life, not even the hint of Mortimer's flock and the wealthy ticket holders who had attended the performance. At least not at first glance. However, the floors and walls were splattered with gore and vice versa. Cole rolled his R's erratically, savoring the feel of the words on his tongue, and the meat hooks that hung around the building were adorned with fresh meat, but it wasn't a cattle or mutton this time. They all had been butchered, I muttered darkly. Oh, but maybe not, Cole exclaimed animatedly. You see, while the initial reports claimed that everybody at the building that night had been murdered by an unknown assailant, many years later one of the policemen was said to have made a startling confession. With his dying breath, this policeman, one Anthony Brown, claimed that it was true and that remains discovered at the place where those Mortimer's followers and guests. Upon closer inspection, they discovered one survivor from that fateful night, Mortimer himself. Upon spying the colossal, blood-soaked butcher hiding behind the hanging carcasses, a cry rang out and Mortimer attempted to flee. Finally, the policeman cornered the man onto the roof, where wielding a large cleaver in his trade, a fugitive Mortimer was said to have put up a frightful struggle, one of which saw 2 policemen lose their lives and Brown himself maimed and disfigured. Finally, constably, they were able to overpower their monstrous quarry. Yet, despite the horrors that they had already witnessed, it was what happened next that haunted Brown until his dying day. I leant forward eagerly. It pains me to say this, but at that point I was captivated by Cole's tale and desperate to hear through the conclusion. Incensed by the loss of their friends and comrades, appalling the shocking discretion of the human form from what they had witnessed in the slaughterhouse below, the policemen decided to mete out justice of their own. They dragged the struggling, screaming Mortimer down the bowels of the building, where they hung him on his own meat hooks, the man's own cruel steel piercing flesh, suspending him above ground in agony as slowly the life bled out of him. Cole grinned and added, Brown said it took Mortimer nearly 2 years to die. Suddenly Cole clapped his hands together, breaking the spell Maccabee's story had woven and caused me to start with an involuntary exclamation. So there you have it, he said, his tone controversial and normal once more, the grim tale of Lucien Mortimer. I pondered the story for a moment, and then the doubts that sprang to my mind. And quite the tale it is, I exclaimed, but it seems to be one built on the gossip and heresy and very little of much substance. Not at all, Cole protested, agitated. The murders at the Whitechapel slaughterhouse are a matter of public record. They were widely reported in the newspapers at the time. I believe I have an evening edition of the Standard which broke the news. Bristling at Cole's continued bragging, I snapped, and these reports corroborate this policeman Brown's story? To a degree, Cole said coolly. The bodies are all accounted for, but something is not. Oh? I replied curiously. The sheet music, the Abattori or Concerto. But surely that was just a ruse, I interjected. A means to lure Mortimer's victims into the scene so he and his minions could sacrifice them? You may think so, Cole replied, nodding. But there was something listed among the evidence we discovered that eve scene that made you wonder. You see, as well as the bodies and belongings of Mortimer's flock and their victims, it was reported that wrecked remains and grand piano were also discovered at the scene. My eyes widened in this revelation as Cole curled his lips in disdain and went on. Crescents and bloody Chartelin claimed to have recently obtained one of the keys from the piano for his own collection. Cole shrugged dismissively as he said, Absolute bladderdash, of course. It's clearly a fake. I have it on good authority that the remains of the piano were destroyed in a fire at a police warehouse some 15 years later. Could the sheet music have suffered the same fate? I asked. Who knows? Cole replied with a wary grin. It may be forever lost to the passage of time. We sat in silence for some time, sipping our brandy. Yet, despite the lack of conversation, we both understood what had happened right there. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The game was now on. Our race had begun. The hunt for the Abattori Concerto was long, twisting and turning pursuit that consumed me over the years. Yes, my collection grew impressively as I obtained items of other collectors might have killed to possess. Yet all along, my failure to secure that music sheet haunted me. Some of the times I felt like I was near to making a breakthrough, and I became overjoyed at the very thought of it. At the others I heard Julian call, was drawing close to having his grasping clutches, and I have despaired. Yet days turn to weeks, weeks turn to months, months turns into years, and still the arbiter concerto elude us both. Over the years I have learned to play the piano, paid for the finest tutor money could buy, and so that was when the day came when I finally laid hands on the music sheet. I would be able to play myself, to hear the work that had gained such much infamy. Some occasions in the game between Call and myself rather underhanded, but this is the nature of pursuits such as this. I had once paid an air traffic controller and a considerable sum to delay Cole's jet on runway so I could get up to lead before him. Cole himself bribed an intimate scholar to expert British history to free me from steadily stream of false information that sent me on a wild goose chase to Edinburgh in Scotland. Out of all the places we both cursed the other's names on multiple occasions, yet on those times in which we came face to face, were always regarded as one another with the begrudging respect that only feel forward toward a truly worthy advisory. Yes, we were rivals, but in a lot of ways Julian Call is the closest thing I ever had to a best friend. My investigation led me to many far-flung locations, from supposedly haunted house in the British countryside to an abandoned lighthouse in the abandoned tube tunnels beneath the London's bustling tunnels. I even spoke with a paranormal investigator here in the States, a funny young fellow by the name of Roman Proudlock, who had heard of Mortimer and the beings with whom he was said to have communicated. He tried to warn me against pursuing this course of action, but he said the entities that glued Mortimer at the most dangerous in this or any other plane of existence. I scoffed. There was no room for superstition. Among the collectors such as I has pursued Mr. Proudlock that I would take all the precautions in my search. He gave me names and contact details for occultists who have become valuable assets in building my collection. But sadly, none of them were able to provide me with concrete leads. It proved a very frustrating endeavor, but still I soldiered on, and I would not be dissuaded. I could not. Finally, the breakthrough came, just 1 month ago. I'm sure you can imagine my surprise, when after all the effort and resources I had expended in my efforts to locate the Abattori Concerto, it was an isolated phone call that would deliver it to me. I sit on the board of a number of companies, some of which were very wide-reaching indeed. These firms have been benefited from my ruthless and calculating business acumen. In exchange for my guidance, I received handsome financial reward. An essential asset to collectors such as myself was that the receptionist at one of these companies, who called me during lunch, apologizing profusely, but claiming to have a man on the line that said I needed to speak with him. I was livid to have dining interrupted, to assure the receptionist that if this call were to be a waste of my time, it would also prove to be a waste of her career. She apologized once again, but said to the gentleman was quite insistent. I sighed resignedly and then instructed her to transfer the call. The call sounded awful. It had a hissing and stuttering quality that led me to believe it was coming from overseas. The deduction was quickly reformed when the man on the other line began to speak. Hello, is this Mr. Pope? The guttural yet nasal Cockney accent of a native Londoner. This is he, I replied coolly. I hear you've been looking for something, the man went on. A piece of music, is that right? That would depend on the piece in question, I said. I might inquire as to what exactly which you are referring to. The cockney laughed, hoarsely scratchy sound. He was clearly a smoker and almost certainly a heavy drinker too. Yeah, you might, Mr. Pope. You might, he said. I am talking about the Abattori Concerto. Someone told me you want it, and I've got it. It may be of interest, I replied, still skeptical of the man's calm claim, if it's genuine. My old great-uncle seemed to think it was. He kept it in his safe. I'm the only one left in our family, so now it is mine. He paused, and I can hear the cogs of his mind turning before he spoke once more, which means it could be yours. I'm sorry, sir, I replied, but you must have somewhat of a disadvantage. I don't believe I caught your name. All right you are, Mr. Pope, he replied. My name is Fred Brown. Brown, the name of the policeman aimed at the Mortimer's slaughterhouse. It was too preposterous to comprehend. Oh, please, Mr. Brown, I cried intentionally. Is this really the best that you and Call can conjure up between you? You could tell Julian that he's losing his touch. I ain't working with Mr. Call, Brown barked. But I can if you don't meet my terms. As a businessman, I pride myself with the ability to read people, my aptitude of deriving a hidden meaning from intonation. There was something in Brown's voice that caused me to give for the night tonight. A little flustered, and I attempted to wrest control of the situation from another man. I don't mean to cause you any offense, Mr. Brown, but will you understand my wariness? If you have it in your possession, in which you claim to have, is it something that many individuals have sought for a great number of years? Perhaps you can convince me to it as authentically. I could tell you that my great-uncle's old man, Tony, was an old Bill, a copper, he said, picking up my own confusion. Old Tony didn't have free fingers on his left, and he had on the big scar running down his boat race, a rhyming slang, boat race face. I have conducted extensive research on Lucien Mortimer over the years, but I have not limited my attention to him. I have looked into each of his followers, his victims and his men who discovered the scene. The description given to me by the man on the phone matched Anthony Brown in all ways but one. Ah, were these the only ways in which old Tony was left altered by his encounter with Lucien Mortimer? I asked. Brown chuckled again, a thick and throaty sound. Nah, he laughed. You already know what happened to his oss. Cleaver sliced through his arse cheek. He limped right up until the day he died. I froze. The detail about the nerve damage in his upper leg and lower back caused by Mortimer's assault was one that very few people know. Brown was also who he claimed to be. The cockneys laughed again at my stunned silence. I reckon that probably convinced you. Ain't that right, Mr. Pope? You mentioned terms, I stammered. What do you want, Mr. Brown? If you want to come to me, he said, I've got a room with a leather apron and white chapel. You come to me, and we'll talk about a price for the music, all right? Listen here, Brown. I shan't to be held ransom, I blustered. Now, Mr. Pope, of course you won't. He laughed. Cheerio, then. I was in the air, flying towards Gatwick Airport within the hour. The whole time I was staring out of the window, not really seeing anything, nervously drumming my fingertips on the tray before me. Could it be? I thought, scarcely daring to believe that my long search might finally be over. Could it be? The black cab pulled up to the outside and squat back brick building that frosted glass windows. The little after 8 p.m. GMT. A battered old sign hung outside. swinging gently by the cold wind. The leather apron. There was an icy mist of drizzling rain hanging in the air, and the dark sky threatening worse weather yet. "You sure you want to get out of here, mate?" the driver asked. I stepped out into the litter-strewn street. "This is a bit of a rough bozer." My security guard Marcus handed over the well-worn 50 pounds note and instructed the cab to wait around our return. A former Marine at 6 feet 5 inches and thickly muscled, Marcus had very little to fear, which means I don't either. So I dismissed the driver's concerns with a casual wave of my hand. Marcus opened the umbrella over my head, sheltering me from the rain. "This way, Mr. Pope," he rumbled, heading towards the dark wooden floors of the leather apron. There was a low chattering hubbub of voices and conversation. Within somewhere a woman laughed loudly and coarsely. The stench of stale ale wafted towards me, causing me to screw up my nose in revolution. "Let's resolve this as expectantly as possible, shall we?" I suggested, and pushed open the door. Ugly peeling flock paper adorned the walls, while heavily stained carpets seemed to stick and tug at my shoes as I walked in out of the rain. At least 35 people sat around inside the pub, perched on rickety wooden stools, huddled together in groups of 2 or 3, each of them nursing pint glasses of larger and ale. Each of every one of them ceased their conversation to stare at the damp interlopers who had joined them in the musty interior. A man stood by the heavily scarred dartboard, frozen, his tattooed right arm still raised, the art unfrown. The man curled their lips contemptuously towards me, then hurriedly looked away when their gaze met with Marcus. Behind that bar, an overweight woman with a straw-bleached hair and seemingly an amount of cleavage on display peered over us at the top of the pint glass she was drying with the towel. "Evening," she said, flashing a smile that never reached her eyes. "What can I get you gents?" "Good evening, madam," I smiled, approaching the bar but taking every care not to touch its murky surface. "I have an appointment with Mr. Brown, I believe. Does he resides here?" "Fred?" He smiled mirthlessly, then pointed. "In the corner, love." I followed her gesture to the far corner of the pub. A man sat alone watching us with a weary grin on his face. At least I thought it was a grin. The man's visage was a mass of scars, which pulled his features into a barely human mask. One practically deep wound crisis crossed the left eye, which was a milky white in his red face. I felt an involuntary shudder of his revolution as I realized that the tip of the man's nose appeared to have been amputated and his left ear was missing, leaving an ugly hole in the sides of his pudgy head. Slowly and awkwardly, the man shuffled to his feet as Marcus and I went to greet him. "Mr. Brown?" I asked, extending my hand to shake his. Brown nodded, smiling even wider as he glanced down at his own right hand. I hurriedly withdrew my own when I realized that Brown sported a prosthetic limb, shiny plastic with 3 metallic hooks where his fingers should have been. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Pope," he rumbled. "And you too, Mr. Marcus remained silent, watching Brown suspiciously. "Right," Brown grinned. "I don't know why you brought this geezer along, Mr. Pope." He then held his prosthesis under his nose. "As you can see, I'm armless." A snicker spread it around the pub, and Brown winked at the unseen left eye at his appreciative audience. "I am sure you understand the prudence of the precaution, Mr. Brown," I responded, ignoring his ill-judged quip. "Just as sure I am you appreciate the value of my time. We shall commence with our negotiations. I mean no offense, but I would like to be certain of the authenticity of this piece." "No worries, Mr. Pope." Brown flashed me another gap-toothed smile. "Come up to my room and we can commence." Brown reached for the dark wooden walking stick behind him. He limped across the sickly carpet. I noticed an odd hollow sound to his footsteps. It seemed that the arm wasn't his only prosthetic limb. The airway up to the room above over the pub was ascended by a narrow door by the restrooms. As we huddled in the foul-smelling passage, Brown gestured towards Marcus with his hook. "I flink giant haystacks over there. There we can wait here," he growled. Marcus shook his head, an apathetic no. "And then the deal's off, Mr. Pope," Brown declared. "That bloke decides isn't gonna take the sheet music off me. There ain't much I can do about it, is there? I'm not taking that risk." I stood and contemplated this situation. "Let Marcus go see the room, so he knows you have no incompetencies in lying wait. So when he waits outside the door," I suggested, "the patrons of this establishment might have both Marcus and myself. You know who I am and where I'm from. You can easily alert the authorities as to the identity before we can flee London. Agreed?" Brown considered my proposition, and then to my relief he nodded. "Up we go then, there," he smiled. There was no sign of bandits preparing to ambush me in Brown's room. In truth, it was too small to accommodate them. A small, unmade single bed with stained sheets sat in one corner. An old television sat beside the table with an overflowing ashtray beside it. There was a microwave with splatters of sauce on the glass door. Beside it was a lime-scale-encrusted basin. Across from the room, a rickety wardrobe leant haphazardly to one side, seeming to slouch against the overflowing bookshelf for support. The room stank of stale sweet, cigarette smoke, Indian food, and rancid beer. After Marcus peered through the door, he said, "I'll be right outside the door, Mr. Pope," fixing Brown with a pointed glare before closing the door behind him. The cockney stood watching me for a moment before quietly saying, "Are you sure you want this, Mr. Pope? It's not too late to walk away." He spoke without any hint of bravado. He had demonstrated in front of the drinkers in the bar downstairs, and I found myself a little mystified by the sudden change of his demeanor. "I'm here at your request, Brown," I smiled. "I've wasted a great deal of time already, and I should like to conclude our business before any more is wasted. I don't know what you hope to accomplish with this greatest gambit, but my patience is beginning to wear thin." For a moment Brown's face twisted, as if he were struggling with a decision, but no sooner I had noticed the expression when it was replaced with that same easy, knowing grin. "Very well, Mr. Pope," he growled. "Very well." Suddenly he turned onto his heel, surprisingly swift movement, considering his disability, and clumped across the room in the bookshelves. He rummaged through the dog-eared paperbacks and tatty-covered magazines. "Aha!" he said, turning back to flash to a vaguely lewd wink and pulling something from the shelf. As he limped towards me, I saw that it was a pornographic magazine. A dull-eyed woman in cheap nylon lingerie, gazing from the cover what is supposedly a seductive manner. My face obviously betrayed my disdain as Brown chuckled. He held it up to offer me a better look. "You read this one?" he wheezed with a smirk of amusement. "I must have missed it," I replied stonily. "The music, Mr. Brown?" All right, the scared cockney replied as he opened the magazine with a shaky hand. He retrieved some yellowing scraps of paper from inside. I don't know how to explain the feeling that washed over me at that moment, but I can only describe it as a sudden, unwavering, and unmistakable certainty. I knew as soon as I saw those tattered sheets that I finally found it. My life's goal as within this grasp. "My word," I muttered, unable to mask my emotions. Brown smiled sadly at me. "I know," he said hoarsely. "So I reckon you've been looking for this? And I reckon it's been waiting for you too." I could feel the sweat under my shirt, despite the cold London night drawing in. My palms were slick, my mouth was dry, and hesitantly I reached for the stairs in Brown's hand. "May I?" I stammered. Brown hesitated, pulling the music sheet away from fraction as involuntary reaction. I don't know what I would have done had Fred Brown refused to continue with the deal. I am not a violent man, nor am I the one often resorts to physical effort when I could pursue more cerebral course. But as Brown stood between the Abattor's Concerto, and I felt an urge to set upon him, the rain blows down, and mishappen and scarred head. Thankfully, Brown averted his course when he sighed heavily and wearily. He even passed me the papers. I took them gently, reluctantly, my heart racing as I took the distinctive looping signature of Lieutenant Mortimer on the first page. Tears began spraying to my unbidden my eyes. "It really is," I whispered. "Oh, my lord, it really is." I turned my attention to Brown, beaming manically in his direction. "Your price, Mr. Brown? What's the price for the piece?" "I reckon a price is worth 50 grand. I almost laughed at this figure. 50 grand? I would have had to pay 20 times that sum. "Very well," I nodded, trying to conceal my glee. "Marcus has a Tachem case with money. May I retrieve it?" Brown nodded, then headed out with good hand, which now I noticed was missing 2 fingers. "I'll take that while you do that, Mr. Pope." I experienced a terrible wrenching sensation as I handed the Abattori Concerto, in rational fear that if I left the room now, both the sheet music and my scarred Cockney world would have vanished upon my return. Of course my concerns were unfounded. After removing Brown's fee from the case, which left me the case still practically full with the banknotes, I returned and found him glancing wistfully at the sheet music. He took his payment, not pausing to count or check the authenticity of the notes. He was distracted and stared at the music with the look of yearning as I carefully placed each sheet of stereo in the plastic bag, taking every care to preserve Mortimer's masterpiece. Finally, our business was concluded, but I needed to ask something before I left. "Mr. Brown," I inquired, "have you, My eyes darted to the hole in the side of where his head and once an ear had been. Mr. Brown followed my gaze and grinned sadly. "I have heard it, Mr. Pope. Yes, I have." "How is it?" I asked. Tears suddenly sprang from Brown's eyes, trickling down his scared cheeks. "It's magnificent," he whispered. "You'll never be the same once you've heard it." I nodded, suddenly eager to be fair from this fetid little hovel and back in my own room. "Very well," I replied, staring at the door and flinging it wide, revealing the alert and attentive face of Marcus in the dim hallway beyond. "A pleasure doing business with you." Brown barely responded, instead staring down at his prosthetic arm, slowly shaking his head. As I closed the door behind me, he finally spoke softly, 2 quiet words of misery. "I wasn't." Even with the Abattori Concerto in the attache case, firmly cuffed to Marcus with thick wrist, I was paranoid that it might have not been snatched away from me. I glanced anxiously from side to side as we walked out into the wet London night and over to the waiting cab. As we drove through the dark streets towards the airport, I wiped at the foggy windows, glaring mistrustfully at any headlights behind us. I bristled as we passed through the security with the VIP departure lounge in the airport, breaking into a cold sweat when the case left my sight briefly while it went through the X-ray machine. Even as we sat in our spacious seats above the plane, I clutched the case close to my chest, alert for any sign of scenery from Julian Cull's lackeys. It never came. The drive from the airport back to my home was probably the fraught yet. The freeway pileup that supposedly killed a man and a woman at the scene, and left another man and a child hospitalized, sent us on a lengthy detour. I became convinced that this was an elaborated ruse to send us into an ambush. I stared intensively at the trees either side of the road. They were covered in missing child posters, but I never saw the boy's face, instead scanning the woods for any sign of thieves. Finally, the iron gates of my home closed behind my vehicle. I breathed a sigh of relief, then laughed aloud triumphantly. After so many years and so much work and so much heartache, the Abattori Concerto was mine. I sat at the grand piano. Mortimer's work mounted on the ornate oak music stand, and the stand was the one I had acquired some 15 years earlier, when it was once said to belong to the famous occultist Ezekiel Pasena. It seemed apt. The house was eerily silent. I have dismissed all my staff for the evening and eliminated my risk of interruption. A moment like this was to be savored. I would not swallow anything or allow anyone to spoil it. I cracked my knuckles, limbering up my fingers, then licked my lips in anticipation. The air still seemed to hum and cackle, but it was as if the world itself was so eager as I hear Mortimer's work. "Very well," I whispered to myself. "Let's begin." I stumbled into my bedroom. 30 minutes later, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I stumbled and grasping at the doorframe for support. How he had done that. I had never believed a piano so capable of making such sounds. Even now and then I could hear it in my mind, the unmistakable thudding of the cleaver, the rending flesh, the squeals and the cries of livestock as they met their end. Even the anguished tears of men and women as they beheld their own ruination at otherworldly hands. It was not just music, it was a whirling lament, of evocation of the lifetime of bloodletting and misery that butcher, that monster, that Mastro had witnessed. Playing it had been exhausting, hearing it had been horrified, experiencing it had been exhilarating. I collapsed onto my bed, too physically drained to disrobe. The Abattori Concerto was still whirling around in my added mind. As I looked up at the ceiling, the unseen, inky darkness of night, and grinned apathetically. As I sank into the waiting embrace of my sleep, my body succumbing to the last of the rigors of performing Lucien Mortimer's eldritch work. My fingers writhed and twitched at their own accord. It was as if they were already yearning to play it again. The dream came almost instantly. At first it was sounds, even smells. The imagery had not come until later. I heard the clink of chains, the squeal of metal scrapped on metal, and the huffling breathing of beasts. I could smell the rank odor of their bodies, the musk of the creatures in the enclosed space, mingling with the pungent smell of dung and rancid aroma stench of urine. Yet there was something else, a scent that lurked just beneath these, barely there, yet somehow permeating everything, the coppery tang of blood. The dream was full of sounds, smell of fear, and the sounds of smell of the Abattor. So it came to a surprise when the fog of sleep obscuring my vision slowly dispersed and revealed an empty, abandoned slaughterhouse. It was an old building, the paint flaking from the damp bulged walls and multiple places a thick layer of dust coating the rusty iron rails that separated from the narrow walkways that would wound through the empty animal pens, the wooden floors of the livestock enclosures, and the crammed runs that linked them, still bore into some sparse, brittle bunches of prehistoric straw, and large, dirty, brown clots of sawdust. The floor itself had a pinkish twinge, evidence to too many failed attempts to wash away any spilled blood. The place seemed huge, and as I took my first flattering step, it produced a cavernous echo that reverberated around the building. I moved slowly, following the designated path between the pens, despite the emptiness that my eyes presented me with. The sounds and smells of the Abattoir continued. The building was uncomfortably hot, possessed of the sticky humidity, with hundreds of bodies crammed into a small space. About the grunts and snuffles of livestock became louder and louder, causing me to wince a little as I made my way unsteadily into the depths of the building. The feeling of overwhelming dread that washed over me seemed to collide with the first squeal. Despite the hubbub I had heard straight away, the high-pitched shriek of animal terror, it was desperate, hopeless sound, and the sound of a beast on the butcher's block. Somewhere among the throng of invisible creatures, another cry rang out, another piercing scream of dismay. This one seemed closer and louder, and the proximity of its fear caused my sweltering hot body to turn cold. The animal's shriek was joined by another and another and another. One by each of the beasts joined the sickening chorus of the abject horror, the volume of their cries' anguish rising to deafening level. I clamped my hands over my ears in a futile attempt to muffle the screams, yet there was still the volume rose, hammering into my ears like rusty nails. This was not a mere sound. It was a sensation I could feel within my chest. Pure, unadulterated bestial fear. It became so loud, so overwhelming that it drove me to my knees and grime-encrusted floor, a cry of desperation springing from my own lips and blending with that of livestock. The waves of that sound beat me down on me. The rain hammers blows that left me dizzy, driving the air into my lungs and tears from my eyes. Then I just thought I could stand it to more, and the slaughterhouse fell silent. I cautiously lowered my hands, panting like an exhausted dog. A hot, fresh puddle of vomit lay before me, and I had no recollection of heaving it out onto the filthy floor. But an aching sensation in my stomach and vile taste at the back of my throat confirmed that I most certainly had. My eyes steamed and I wiped them with the back of my hand, then climbed to my feet, trembling as I did so. Now the dissipated slaughterhouse was eerily silent, rasping the sound of any hitching breaths and metronomic clip-clop of my footprints into the Italian leather barouches, the only noises that pierced that still, ill and dusty air. Ahead of me I noticed a rickety iron stairway that ascended up to the cobweb-shrouded catwalk suspended cautiously from the ceiling. I cursed out loud. I had no intention to risk my life and limb on those skeletal age-ravaged structures, and began to look for an alternative means of an exit. But the expletive I muttered was not met with silence. Instead, it only meant to act as a cue for an unseen musician somewhere deep within the bowels of the building. For the echo of my voice and barely faded, a loud and jarring slam on the piano's keys caused me to cry out again. My heart pounded in my chest, feeling the utter terror washing over me again as the piano sounded, and I realized that I was listening to the opening notes of the Abattori Concerto. No, God, no, I muttered to myself as I scurried back the way I came, suddenly desperate to be free of the accursed slaughterhouse. A sickening feeling of dread washed over me as I realized what I was heading towards the piano. I froze, unsure of what to do, paralyzed with the indignation. The mesmerizing rhythm of the Abattori Concerto continued, seeming to fill the air. Or did it? There were other sounds too. The clinking and scraping of chains being dragged towards me. It was the recognition of that sound that spurred me into action. Yes, the rusted catwalks might have been dangerous, but I would sooner take my chances with them than with the chained pianist. My footsteps on the iron stairs sent deafening booms throughout the slaughterhouse, the stairs shaking and lurching alarmingly beneath me. Yet more terrifying still the noise that was met with my echoing footsteps, an increased, more agitated clinking of chains, as if whatever was dragging them had been excited by the sound of my retreat. When I reached the top of the stairs, I made a terrible mistake of peering down at the dirty floor below. I was at least 30 feet in the air, a realization that caused me to grip the filthy handrail for dear life, causing it to shed flakes of rust that stained my palms. The catwalk were in ill repair. At several points in my passage, caused nuts and bolts, and even a few chunks of metal to plummet to the floor below with a deafening clang, while dust and dirt rained down about me from the supports that attached them to the ceiling. With a shudder, I noticed the catwalks continued on to the bowels of the building, terminating at a hungry-looking doorway to the attic. I froze again, contemplating my next move. It was while I stood and I thought that I glanced back in the direction from which I had come and saw a movement. At first, I wasn't sure if I'd seen it, suspected it was probably a trick of my tired eyes or fearful imagination. But then I saw it again, and there could be no mistaking this time. It was something dark and huge, scurrying through the walkways between the animal pens with a deadly air of purpose. It was a figure, unnaturally tall, with long limbs trailing rusty, glistening chains behind it. It was only then I realized that the monstrous figure was heading for the base of the rickety staircase that I had just ascended, that I overcame the terror that pinned in place, turned and ran. My feet crashed upon the catwalk, which shook and shuddered beneath me. But I didn't care. My only priority was getting away from that monstrous figure, escaping the sound of the Abattori Concerto, which was still echoing around the building. It was a reckless urgency that caused me to rush into the final section of the walkway between myself and the door without first checking its integrity. I hurtled along, spurred on by the sight of the door, or finally within reaching distance, when an ear-splitting shriek left the side of the walkway, tore free of the ceiling, and lurched sharply sideways. Suddenly I was pitched towards the sagging side, briefly crying out before I slammed onto the handrail. It struck me in the ribs, diving in the air from my lungs and turning my cry into a strangulated wheeze. I remained slumped against the handrail, trying to catch my breath as white spots swam before my eyes. For what felt like minutes, but in truth could only have been seconds, I slouched there, grasping. The catwalk creaked obnoxiously and slowly continued my leaning gently to my side. Acutely aware of the danger I was in, I pushed myself upright again, using the handrail for leverage. Yet just before I regained my vertical base, there was a sickening, hollow, wrenching sound, and the handrail broke free of the struts that supported it and tumbled over onto the end of the floor, hitting it with the echoing clang. As I stood teetering on the edge, my arms pinwheeling to regain my balance, rocketing back and forth on my tiptoes, a drip of sweat fell from the tip of my nose. I saw an arc down to the blood-stained wood flooring and was struck with the sudden-crushing certainty that my body would follow. It never did. Instead, I was able to regain my footing, precautious as it was, and continue my route towards the doorway before me. I shuffled towards it, gingerly wincing at every noisy protestation from my catwalk and the struts, until finally I was able to grasp the doorknob, all the while accompanied by the strains of the otherworldly pianist. As I breathed heavily and a heartfelt sigh of relief when I turned freely and opened the room beyond, as I finally stepped free of that damned walkway and glanced back the way I had come, the catwalks were clear. There was no sign of shadowy pursuer I had spied before. I allowed a weary grin across my face and moped at the sweat of my brow, then froze when I heard the first booming footstep. It was heavy, the footstep of a huge being. It had similar metallic quality. The staircase. My pursuer was ascending the staircase. As if to confirm this realization, second crashing footstep rang out, then a third. Each was perfectly in time with the tempo of Lucien Mortimer's music. With the surge of panic, I pulled the door closed behind me, turned and ran straight into a cold, damp mass of solid flesh. I cried out, shielding my face from an unexpected attack, but it never came. I carefully lowered my hand and saw why. I had ran into a butcher animal carcass which was now swung gently back and forth on its hook. The room was full of such carcasses, each headless and limbless, skinned and gutted. There were at least to be 60 of them between myself and the far end of the room. As such, I was unable to see what awaited for me there. But that mattered not, for I was too aware of what awaited in my wake. I had no choice, so I cautiously proceeded, pushing my way through the hanging slabs of meat. My passage seemed to have set them swinging, causing each hook to squeak and creak as I disturbed its load. I did not know what was worse, the fact that it was together a chorus of meat hooks played the Abattori Concerto, or the fact that part of me was thrilled to hear it again. Nevertheless, I forged on, plunging deep into the meat locker, searching for an exit, seeking for an escape route. The room now seemed to be stretched to an impossible size, the hanging carcasses of creating never-ending labyrinth. Time and again, I cried out as I detected movement from the corner of my eye, only to realize it was simply one of the slabs of meat swinging back and forth. I became hopelessly lost, running into the clammy chunks of beef and pork, leaving my palms pink with the blood that still oozed from them. All about me, the hooks creaked away, singing the Mortimer's song to me. The Abattor or Concerto was now rising in pitch and tempo, building towards a thunderous crescendo, a moment I longed for as much as I dread. Then it came, with a savage crash. I heard the door behind me explode into fragments of timber. The thing that was hunting me was now inside the room. I heard it bearing down on me, ready funking noise as it ripped the meat behind me. It was the sound of the cleaver and flesh. I panicked then, running blindly forward, desperate to escape my pursuer. The swinging heavy slabs of meat jolted me, buffeting me to all sides. Now my hands and clothes were drenched in blood. The meat here seemed fresher and fresh flesh wetter. I did not pause to ponder this, though. Instead, I was fleeing for my life and my very soul, and nothing could hinder my flight. That was until the face appeared before me. I screamed again, slamming the individual who had materialized before me. I felt at that moment that my life was over, and that the monstrous huntsman sent by the infernal pianist had found me at least, and would soon end my existence. But I was wrong, for the face that was not part of the predator, it was one of its prey. As I gagged in horror, I realized that the body before me was quite dead, a naked man missing his limbs, and his abdomen sliced wide open, and his innards filtered. His eyes were wide, lifeless, yet filled with terror, while his mouth was stretched upon the silent and eternal scream. "Oh God!" I cried, glancing about me, and finally looking at hanging meat and surrounded me. Human corpses hung all around, arms drooped limply from hooks, and hands pointing to the blood-soaked floor beneath it. Legs hung, dripping blood from the fleshy wounds, in the place of which there were joined hips, carved torsos that swung gently back and forth, in time with still building strains of the Abattori Concerto. But building to what? I could not stay here and see, for I knew it would spell the end of me. So on I charged, shouldering against the human remains that made up of butcher's macabre display. I did the sound of my pursuer blade grew louder and louder and closer and closer. I might have gone a little mad during that hopeless retreat through the hanging dead, weeping and screaming as I ran from the thing behind me. It was close to hell as I could imagine. The experience broke something inside my mind, a piece that has yet to heal even now. Yet at that point, I felt that I could take no more. I saw it, the doorway that had eluded me for so long, and beyond it was a staircase. I almost wept with the relief and hurried towards it. As I drew closer, I was finally able to see the walls. More precisely, I was able to see the symbols crudely carved into them by any blades or daubed upon them in blood. They were ancient sigils, wards and hexes of great power, the arcane alphabet of the occult. The individuals who had carved them had taken symbols from dozens of ancient civilizations, combining them into something new, yet older than humanity itself. These symbols were the gateway. The sacrifices had been simply the key. Finally, I stumbled through the dark archway of the doorway. I cast a fearful look behind me among the swinging cavitators. Something vast and dark surged towards me, trailing chains and hooks and blood. With no time I catch my breath, hurried up the stairs to the wooden stairs, stomping up the dirty cloud of thick dust, and as I climbed. The staircase was dark and poorly lit, but flickering glow and headed guided my feet. Still the Abattori Concerto played louder and louder. It was only when I emerged the dim chamber atop the stairs that I saw why. The room was empty, except for one piece of furniture, a large grand piano, topped with the ordinary candelabra. fat, waxy candles dripping from down its sides and casting a small halo of light about over the piano. Beyond the light there was nothing but blackness, a bottomless, endless abyss. At first I couldn't see the pianist. I thought that the piano might have been playing itself. The unnatural and unnerving as it might sound, I wish I had been the case, for I stared at the piano open-mouthed and sweat-soaked. Finally I spotted the source of the music. Disembodied and severed right arm, the knuckles tattooed and glistening, the white knob of bone protruding from the fleshy grist at the end of the fingers, danced back and forth across the piano's keys. I knew instantly that it was Fred Brown's, the amputated limb he had joked about in the leather apron, and I knew then that it was the thing chasing me that had taken the arm from him, as well as the leg, the ear, his nose, and who knows how many other body parts. As if to confirm his dread epiphany, there came that familiar booming footstep behind me on the stairs. I backed away from the staircase, knowing I was now trapped and cornered. There would be no escape. Again the footsteps came, crashing and slamming onto the stairs, seemingly to cause the entire room to shake. The candles guttering out, remaining alight nevertheless. Each step fell perfectly in time with the severed arm's performance. In the shadows, beyond the flickering candlelight, something huge advanced towards me. Slowly the figure began to take its shape. At least 10 feet tall, dressed in a blood-splattered lawn, white butcher's coat beneath the heavy brown leather apron coated with gore, the traditional boater and pierced the top of the head that sported unkempt, matted black hair and long, thick black beard. The hat's brim casting the man's face in the shadow. The giant ascended the stairs, slowly, almost nonchalantly. He trailed the chains behind him, each secured by the barbed meat hooks that pierced his flesh, dark blackish blood dripping from him as he came. In each hand he held a huge, cruel meat cleaver, and the blade unnaturally sharp and gleaming hungrily in the light. "Oh God, no," I whispered despairingly. "No, no, 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 no." Finally, Lucien and Mortimer reached to the top of the stairs. As diabolical being before me raised the cleavers to each side, a posture of blasphemous mockery of crucifixion. The candlelight should have been illuminated by his face, but the shadows clung to the Mortimer's visage as if they belonged to each together. The only light pierced the gloom beneath the boater came to the form of two pinpricks from the blue fire that blazed malevolently at me from the butcher's eyes. There was also humor there. Burning sadistic madness matched its intensity only by the cold, psychotic cruelty also present in its glistening orbs. That gaze promised of savage, unholy disgration of my flesh, an inevitable slaughter that would cause suffering beyond measure. And then, with the unnatural speed, Mortimer swept towards me, cleavers raised high. I awoke with a start, crying out loud, and clutching at my chest as if to stop my pounding heart from breaking free. As I sat up frantically, looking about me, it took me a few moments to recognize my bedroom, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of my breaking dawn. When at last I breathed a long, shuddering sigh of relief that seemed to sap me of what little strength I had left. The dream was so realistic, so lifelike. I had honestly felt my very life was in danger. I sat there gasping for breath for some time, before finally fearing the worst had passed. I was wrong. From deep in my house, I heard the familiar sound of a piano. My piano, and the pianist was playing the Abattori Concerto. A sick feeling washed over me, my earlier tranquility dashed, my mind crashing headlong back to the state of crippling panic. It was during that moment that I first noticed the thin red rivulets that trickled down the front of my white dresser beside my bed. Confused, my gaze was drawn to the top, where I finally laid my eyes on the assorted objects neatly arranged upon its surface. Somebody had placed a number of thick cuts of meat there. They were lean, fresh cuts, at least a dozen sizable discs of meat, and with a thick piece of white bone in the center. Each was a deep reddish pink, streaked with a tin marbling of fat, and glistening in the warm light. This was meant to the highest quality work of any butcher would be proud. My brow furrowed in confusion, and as the pianist played on, I moved to get out of bed to investigate the odd meat and the origin of the music. I knew instantly that something was wrong, the sheet shifting in a way that felt unusual. Glancing down, the familiar shape of my body looked different. "No," I whispered, too afraid to pull back the sheets, but knowing I had to. "No." Steeling myself, sweat dripping down from the small back, I pulled the sheet away. I gazed at the stumps where my legs had been for a long time, not being able to make sense of what I was seeing. Each thigh ended up above the knee, expertly amputated by a surgeon considerable skill, with neat, fresh stitches, drawing the angry red skin together and sealing off the wounds. Then it came to me, and I screamed over and over, screaming until my voice became hoarse, my vocal cords bloody in my throat. I wept uncontrollably at the renunciation of my body, clenching my fist and shaking my head in a dumbly futile gesture of denial. It was then I shook my head and that my eyes came to rest on the chops of my dresser, beautifully prepared cuts of meat, bone in. Only I did realize what this meat meant. I laughed, madly hysterically, waving my arms in time to listen Mortimer's masterpiece, laughing until I thought my lungs would burst. I awoke then from the dream within a dream. I was in my bed in my room, but there was no sickly yellow light. The room was still pitch black in the middle of the night. It was then my own deranged laughter that woke me up, and waking into this, in the real world, acted like a bucket of cold water over my head, sobering me instantly. I lay there in the darkness, listening to my heart pounding in my ears. It was the beating from the Abattori Concerto. Before I knew it, I was humming in the piece, my fingers again eagerly twitching to play. But I did not get out of bed, and did take a long walk to my grand piano. Yet I must hear it. I know I must perform it again. This was my life's pursuit, and I could not live without it. Never again. Since I heard it, I'll never be the same. Yet, despite this urge, instead, I reached for the phone beside my bed and composed this post, telling my story to the past time until my staff arrive. You see, I know that I will require them to carry me the piano. For even now, in the darkness of midnight, I can see the oozing shapes atop my dresser, glistening by the light of my phone. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.